Welcome to the chaos sector. We are working on the presentation of the home, but let's review everything we know, what has been reported, and what has been alleged to be true. First, we address later that morning, and work our way backwards. If you're ignorant to the past, then you are oblivious to the future, as one would say. Everyone scrutinized the surviving housemates, about the 8-hour time gap before authorities were called, right? Now, this question seems to be the obvious, and everyone did in fact ask this question. But, if Bethany was alleged to be asleep, and Dylan had locked herself in the bedroom, and also fell asleep, how could they be capable of calling 911, when they are not even awake to discover anything to warrant a 911 call? Do you understand? It is reported that Dylan had went back to sleep, after witnessing the alleged Kohberger. So if she went to sleep, how could she know anything had happened? Bethany also was assumed to be asleep. Obviously we know they were awake, but if the reports claim they were asleep after the alleged Kohberger left the home, why would they question an 8-hour gap before calling 911? Shouldn't they make sure to point out they were asleep? I need you to understand that question by the mainstream media, because they have the report, which claims they were asleep. So then, why ask a question that doesn't have the physical reality associated with it? Now many may think, it's just how the night unfolded, deceased peers in the home, and 2 survivors were asleep while their friends lay in cold blood. Yet, I need you to rethink that. The mainstream media is echoing what social media questioned, because they use common sense, and knew Dylan didn't go back to sleep, and Bethany more than likely had awakened. But they won't literally establish this in their news segments. They present a question that alludes to the survivors being awake, and somehow didn't call 911 until 8 hours later. Not realizing they are playing into the hands of social media, who believe the survivors may have been involved. They have to address it, or rather, present an inquiry, as a form of damage control. It's damage control, because once the mainstream media asked that question, it was addressed, and now they move on to the suspect. No more concerns about the survivors' actions. In fact, they never truly addressed if the survivors heard any of the violence in the home. They may have touched on it, but not to present the possibility that the survivors may have something to hide. Oh no, we can't do that to the precious college students. Do you understand? Our focus is always what the authorities and mainstream media reported in the case, because a fuzzy picture is fuzzy for a reason. Let's continue. Kohberger had been identified, and was eventually arrested for the murders. If Kohberger is silently sneaking into the house, the first room he would come across is in fact Dylan's room. It is literally the first bedroom visible coming around that kitchen corner. Yet, he bypasses this bedroom, and heads upstairs? So, there was a narrative established early on, that Kohberger had targeted someone specifically in the home. But this specific target has not provided any, I mean literally, any evidence to claim he targeted anyone. If you have followed that trail, notice how there hasn't been any updates, or information, or even evidence, that Kohberger stalked one of the victims? Surely something would have been reported. It doesn't matter now, he's guilty of murder, right? Many may assume all of the so-called critical evidence is being held for trial. Well, going all the way back to our previous series, what evidence would be greater than his DNA found on a knife sheath in the home? This has been so-called confirmed, which essentially leads to a guilty verdict. Without anything else, DNA places the suspect in the home the night of the murders, by way of the knife sheath. Yet, if he had stalked one of the victims, it would be verified in some manner. The point, without any evidence of Kohberger stalking one of the victims, what would be the motive? Mind you, he would travel from Pullman to this specific home, and obviously came prepared to murder someone. Yet without an actual motive being established, what drove him to commit such a massacre? If he had stalked Kaylee Gonzalez, as many have suggested, wouldn't there be some evidence on his phone, or even his laptop? Where are the alleged DM messages he sent to one of the victims? Is this being held for trial? If it's being held for trial, then this would mean the prosecution doesn't want to reveal the supporting evidence. Yet if this were the case, then why would private investigators, such as Mark Furman, come out and claim that Kaylee had complained about a stalker? But, when Kohberger had been arrested and charged with the murders, this same Mark Furman never mentioned anything about stalking. If he had proof that Kaylee complained about a stalker, and News Nation reported that a quote, law enforcement source, had obtained quote, digital evidence, that Kohberger had sent one of the victims messages on social media, why didn't he claim Kohberger did it, or was the stalker? Because they needed to thwart the attention away from Dylan's accounts. Remember, it all started with her accounts. Furman is a so-called private investigator, who resides in, take a guess, Idaho. What are the chances of that? A bit too coincidental if you ask me. He is a public figure, and is making claims about one of the victims on live television. Isn't this compromising the investigation? In fact, how could he even state this without addressing this with Moscow PD? He can't go on live television and claim one of the victims was stalked, without confirming this with authorities. He would be jeopardizing the investigation, and could lead to a misdirection, leading Moscow PD down a path that didn't actually exist. You understand? But on the flip side, if Moscow PD ran with that belief, he is not held accountable for spreading disinformation. Yes, it's misinformation, but it is also disinformation, to sway the public's opinion about one of the victims. He is also misrepresenting the victim, as he stated that someone told him that Kaylee complained about a stalker. Yet to this point, there hasn't been anyone from that college circle, the same circle Furman so-called obtained this information from, come out and prove Kaylee complained about being stalked. It was a lie, and Moscow PD knew it was a lie, and they still let the lie be told in the mainstream media. And sure enough, they exacerbated that lie into claiming digital evidence had been collected regarding Kaylee being stalked. Anyway, let's continue. Ethan's sister-in-law had criticized Dylan regarding the gap in time. Now, to be fair, the sister-in-law, to my knowledge, hasn't identified herself. Perhaps someone knows her name. But then again, if you criticize one of the survivors, and you're a relative of one of the victims, of course the mainstream media is not too excited in hearing what you have to say. No media outlet will give her that much-needed interview, because it keeps the criticism constant, regarding the survivors' actions and decisions that night, and the following morning. But we focus on what Dylan told a source, which was completely different what was released in her affidavit. Let's go over this one more time. Quote, a survivor of the University of Idaho killings allegedly thought the noise resulted from partying, asked the victims to quiet down, and mistook the killer as a guest, a source exclusively told News Nation. Now briefly, we understand News Nation has been more of a detriment to the case, but we don't focus on them specifically here. We focus on who is giving them this information, which would be a law enforcement source. The source spoke directly with surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen, who allegedly yelled about the noises heard during the killings, because she mistook it for partying. Mortensen allegedly first heard noises around 4 a.m. She opened her door and yelled, quote, calm down, you're being loud, I'm trying to sleep, unquote. She then closed her door, and locked it, according to the source. Later in the night, Mortensen heard more noises, so she opened her door. She saw the killer walking down the hall, but she wasn't frightened. She assumed he was a guest of the other roommates there partying, according to the source. Now this was not in the affidavit, because it has Dylan interacting, that's right, interacting with her housemates, during the attacks. And there's more from the source. Quote, further information regarding the Idaho murders included Ethan Chapin's sister-in-law, revealing that Mortensen had called all of the housemates, after she heard screaming and crying, coming from their upstairs rooms. Unquote. Now it is assumed that this sister-in-law had been contacted by the law enforcement source, regarding Dylan's accounts. Now here's the kicker to all of this. News Nation has this article on their website, regarding a different chain of events from Dylan, but they never actually reported this on their actual YouTube channel. Because it raises questions, once again, about how that night truly unfolded. And it would obviously bring into question the credibility of the official affidavit released. Can the source be trusted? Did this actually happen? I'll tell you this much, even if Dylan never gave this information to that source, it's something she would have done anyway. That scenario is more likely in that home with her housemates, of Dylan interacting in some manner, to the quote, noise, as opposed to silently opening and closing her door. We extract certain words and instances from both accounts, and reveal the likely scenario. Dylan was awakened around 4 a.m., to what she assumed was Kaylee playing with Murphy upstairs. Notice it states, what she assumed, was Kaylee upstairs playing with Murphy. Just because the dog is heard barking, does this mean Kaylee was playing with him? No, so Kaylee also had to be heard, right? It doesn't clarify that she heard Kaylee talking. This would be when Dylan heard Kaylee screaming, and Murphy was barking because of it. Mind you, this would be what Dylan woke up to. That's sorted out. Now the moment when Dylan allegedly yelled to her housemates, to quiet down? This was to create a scenario where it was a party, but this is still within the time frame of the attacks. In the affidavit, it states she heard what she assumed was Kaylee say, there's someone here, right? Well, how could Kaylee be aware of someone in the home before Dylan would know? If the person was heard walking around on the third floor, wouldn't Dylan also hear those footsteps going up to that third floor? The stairwell is literally right next to her bedroom. And since she was already awake and inspecting noise in the home, surely she knew that someone was walking upstairs. Mind you, this would be before, I repeat, before that intruder reaches Kaylee and Madison. They are walking up the stairs. And of course, in the source's accounts, Dylan heard screaming from upstairs, which she thought somehow was partying. The source is fabricating her accounts as well, but they can't hide everything. Then, Dylan heard crying from Zena's bedroom as she once again opened her door. With this door opened, or cracked, she heard a male's voice say, quote, "It's okay, I'm here to help you," unquote. In the affidavit, it doesn't state that Dylan had closed her door after the second time, which was when she heard cries from Zena's room. It alludes to it, but because details are important, it needed to be clarified that Dylan had closed her door once more after hearing cries from Zena's room. But then, it goes on to say, Dylan opened her door for the third time, and this is when she saw the male. Notice how it says she opened her door for the third time, but doesn't clarify that she had previously closed it after the second time? This is because, the second time she opened her door, she never closed it. She kept it cracked, listening to what was going on. And we can suggest, she never closed her door at all, to be honest. Curiosity kept that door cracked, from the moment she heard screaming upstairs. Quietly listening to what was going on. She was clearly not one of the targets, because she would have been the first person attacked, as her bedroom is the first one spotted around that second floor entrance. And with that being said, it seems apparent that Dylan had knowledge of what would happen that night. Dylan gave a different account of that night, contrary to her affidavit. And also, I'm just gonna go ahead and assume, Dylan doesn't use terms such as quote, clad in black. Moscow PD went over her original accounts, obviously she was a witness, at the least, and decided it was best to completely change it, because she would be compromised in the public's eyes. We're not cruel to Dylan, or even Bethany, we can give them the benefit of being terrified. I have no problem accepting that as the reason for their decisions. But how far does that benefit go, if we factor in they discovered their housemates deceased earlier than what was alluded to? Based on the evidence, that Dylan was aware her housemates were being attacked, we come to the logical conclusion that those bodies were discovered before sunrise. We also come to the logical conclusion that Hunter, Ethan's best friend, and his girlfriend, Emily, who is assumed to be Zena's best friend, or close friend, were also called before sunrise. Now when we look at the time frame before the 911 call, it gives us approximately the same 8-hour gap. In the report, it states that the best friend of Ethan had discovered Ethan and Zena deceased. But it detailed how he came to this conclusion, by checking their pulses, which were not there. There was no mention of blood seen on the victims, on the floor, nowhere on the bed, yet they were stabbed to death. Hunter would see this blood, before he even physically checked for a pulse. He would know, they were more than likely dead. Lack of establishing there was blood seen by Hunter, or even in Dylan's accounts, of observing a so-called unconscious housemate, indicates the authorities did not want to establish, the college students knew they were dead upon discovery. The reason being? It tracks all the way back to screaming, Murphy barking, all of the brutality that unfolded, without Dylan aware of it. A bloodbath is preceded by violence, my friends. That violence was not Kaylee playing with her dog Murphy upstairs. Dylan opened her door the first time, in response to what she thought was Kaylee say quote, "There's someone here," unquote. But why would Dylan open her door in response to this, when she would have known someone was there before Kaylee would? She opened her door after hearing the screaming from upstairs, disguised as Dylan waking up to quote, Kaylee playing with Murphy. It's obvious. No mention of screaming in the affidavit, because this is what would wake Dylan up, along with the barking. That changes the entire chain of events, to the point of the alleged Koberger's departure. So if the initial sign of physical activity in the home had been fabricated, then her accounts of what she observed and heard, have also been fabricated. And if that was all fabricated, then we also assume the actual time she claimed to hear that activity, was fabricated. Don't think Moscow PD would just change her accounts, they would have to change the time frame of those accounts also. We already exposed this, we're going in circles regarding her affidavit. But, the only thing that hasn't been fabricated, Dylan heard screaming. Many people are so caught up in what the prosecution has at its disposal. But they forget, that the defense has that affidavit. And if the public punched huge holes in Mortensen's accounts, what do you think a defense attorney will do with it? They will exploit the inconsistencies, and even a difference in her accounts, by way of law enforcement sources. If she is called in to testify, then everything she stated will be examined in that trial. Although many may assume her different account can't be verified as true, then we have to dig deep into why law enforcement sources claim she gave that different account. Which opens up all types of cans. You see the problem with this trial? Essentially, it is not Koberger who is the focus in the trial, it is Dylan Mortensen. Her different accounts have the truth somewhere in the middle, which the defense team will definitely poke holes into.
So, Miss Mortensen, you were awakened by what you assumed to be Kaylee upstairs playing with her dog, correct?
Yes, sir.
Then, what you told Moscow PD was that you heard what you assumed to be Kaylee upstairs state, quote, "There's someone here," unquote. Is this correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
You then opened your door to check everything out, correct?
Yes, sir.
Miss Mortensen, you claim to have heard crying, which you assumed was coming from Xana's bedroom, is this correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
You also heard a male's voice say something along the lines of, quote, "It's okay, I'm here to help you," unquote. Do I have this correct?
Yes, sir.
When you opened the door the last time, you observed a male in all black, with a mask covering the lower half of his face, walk past you. Is this correct?
Yes, sir, that is what I saw.
Miss Mortensen, I need you to clarify something for me, because it's a bit concerning. It is reported that Ethan's sister-in-law claimed that you had heard screaming, yelled to them about the noise, and even called them during this time frame. You also spotted a male in the home walk past you, but didn't think nothing of it, as you assumed he was a partygoer. Is this correct?
No, sir, that's not correct. I never talked to anyone that night. I woke up to the dog barking, but I just thought it was Kaylee playing upstairs.
Your Honor, I ask that evidence regarding this claim be presented to the court.
Proceed.
Objection, Your Honor.
Objection overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Miss Mortensen, did you ever come in contact with Ethan's sister-in-law?
No, sir, I mean, I know of her, through Ethan, but I wasn't like friends with her, or nothing like that.
I didn't ask if you were friends with her. I'm asking specifically, did you ever come in contact with Ethan's sister-in-law?
Objection, Your Honor. What is the relevance of this questioning?
Objection overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. The reason I ask this question is because Ethan's sister-in-law had knowledge of the law enforcement source that provided those details regarding your accounts to media outlets. I present Exhibit A to the jury. This is the sister-in-law posting a comment regarding the alleged interview with the law enforcement source. Quote, "Yes, I hope it will come out what D, referring to Miss Mortensen, heard. D supposedly called all the girls in the house after hearing crying and screaming stopped and no one answered. And she still didn't call the police. She needs to explain herself and her actions that night." Unquote. Miss Mortensen, are you familiar with this post from the sister-in-law of Ethan?
Objection, objection. The defense is badgering the witness. This is unacceptable.
Objection overruled.
I never saw that post from her. I don't know what she's talking about.
The private investigator obviously will not be identified, as they are private investigators. But this private investigator, which is a law enforcement source, released statements to the media regarding your accounts. Are you saying that you never spoke to this private investigator, nor told them that version of your accounts? Remember, Miss Mortensen, you are under oath in a court of law.
For the sake of integrity in this courtroom, I object to this questioning.
Objection overruled. Proceed.
I never told them anything different. I don't know where that story came from.
But you did speak to that private investigator. You stated you never told them, referring to that private investigator, anything different. Your Honor, I present Exhibit B to the court.
Proceed.
In this article by News Nation, it reports that the source, which would be a private investigator here, had communicated with Miss Mortensen about the events that night. Quote, "The source spoke directly with surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen, who allegedly yelled about the noise during the killings because she mistook it for partying."
Objection, none of this has been confirmed. It is purely speculation, Your Honor.
Objection overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. It goes on to say, quote, "Mortensen allegedly first heard noises around 4 a.m. She opened her door and yelled, quote, 'Calm down, you're being loud, I'm trying to sleep,' unquote. She then closed her door and locked it, according to the source. Later in the night, Mortensen heard more loud noises, so she opened her door. She saw the killer walking down the hall, but she wasn't frightened. She assumed he was a guest of the other roommates there partying. According to the source. Unquote. Miss Mortensen, are you telling the court, under oath, that none of this happened?
I don't know what to say. I'm tired of all this.
To the people of the jury, it is obvious Miss Mortensen's accounts are not credible based on conflicting accounts provided. Either she didn't hear any screaming and was not aware of the killer stealthily maneuvering through the home, or she heard screaming and even interacted with her housemates, including calling them all that night during the murders. In her affidavit, there is no mention of hearing screaming or any interaction with her housemates that night. Also, we can't verify that Miss Mortensen was frozen in a shock state because another account has a different perception of the male in the home. Was she frozen in a shock state, or someone she thought nothing of as a partygoer? If the prosecution believes this is speculation, well, I guess we will bring that private investigator as a witness to corroborate these claims. Until we establish the truth, I ask that the jury consider Miss Mortensen cannot be deemed a credible witness due to the conflicting accounts.
Objection, Your Honor. None of this has been confirmed.
Objection overruled.
I can't allow him to slander my client's image this way.
No further questions, Your Honor.
This is the chaos sector.